Is rhetoric good or bad? Is a good rhetorician a good person? A better question to ask might be, how can we better understand rhetoric by examining language, truth, and identification in rhetorical scholarship? Let's get started by examining classical rhetoric. The sophists argued that human knowledge relies on sense perception and therefore absolute truth cannot be available to humans. Instead, probable knowledge can be gained in examining arguments and debating points to move arguments forward. The sophists sought to call attention to the function of language in inducing belief rather than encouraging audiences to give themselves up uncritically to its power to move and persuade. Early scholars of rhetoric were more directly focused on good and bad rhetoric, appropriate uses of rhetoric, and were concerned with using rhetoric to communicate with audiences. Socrates and Plato thought rhetoric should function as a tool for the good of the state and community and therefore should not be used to mislead crowds. Socrates believed that rhetoric could also be morally improving, but the process of improvement itself seems to be rhetorical, acting by persuasion rather than empirical demonstration or insight. For Plato, truth is pursued through rhetoric. One should convey truth to an ignorant audience by any effective means as long as he's keeping the audience's best interests at heart and working out the truth in his own mind by talking to others in a give-and-take dialogue. This early rhetoric dealing with the attainment of truth seems to tie into the later discussion of identification. Aristotle defined rhetoric as the art of discovering the means of persuasion available for any occasion. Rhetoric should function in situations where audiences aren't qualified for the subject matter or it requires urgent discussion and resolution. For Aristotle, rhetoric that is just and true will prevail, and failure is due solely to the rhetorician. Aristotle's scholarship is useful in understanding later theory of language and rhetoric. These intersections of language and truth, and perhaps morality, become more complex when we fast forward to the Enlightenment, where John Locke suggests that understanding the flaws in our language will help people understand the limits of communicating with words. Locke's goal is to prevent misunderstandings and the inherent problems of language, where lack of natural standards for representations of ideals and mixed modes create various understandings without any concrete definitions. This definition of rhetoric and application, though, may be a bit unrealistic, where a discussion would function only if both parties fully agreed on all terms. Nietzsche's understanding of how we use rhetoric and language is one regarded as deliberately artistic and not natural. Basically, we use language to develop rhetoric, and because language is a purely rhetorical art, it should be held up to examination and not taken in any real way as capital T truth. Like with Locke, Nietzsche sees rhetoric as a social tool, but in a different way. Nietzsche questions knowledge and the value of knowledge and seems to argue that we use rhetoric for survival and social purposes or as a means of preserving the individual. Contemporary scholars like Foucault and Burke complicate our ideas of identity, language, and rhetoric. Foucault draws on Plato and other early rhetoricians as those who created the divide between true and false as creating a system of exclusion, a historical, modifiable, and institutionally constraining system. Foucault examines language as connected to truth and power and how there are always restrictions, gatekeeping, and conditions to inner discourse. This governs our actions, power, and identity formation. Foucault seems concerned with the will to truth and power and how it's in these struggles of truth and power that we push against to form. Where, as history constantly teaches us, discourse is not simply that which translates struggles or systems of domination, but is the thing for which and by which there is struggle. Discourse is the power which is to be seized. Finally, Kenneth Burke looks at how rhetorical discourse creates identification in everyday language. The identification in rhetoric is compensatory to division, creating truths and lies and us versus thems, and consubstantiality, acting together or identifying on certain terms and grounds. Our identity formation transcends our sense of belonging in society, and we should be concerned with the rhetor's ethical responsibility and the obligation we have to the implications of our arguments, regardless of what may have been intended. Our language can bring reality into a number of mediums like ideologies, technologies, and identities. Ultimately, I think that we can agree that yes, rhetoric is everywhere and it can be intended for persuasion, but what's particularly interesting is that we can see rhetoric now as more than a means of persuasion and find the processes of identification at work. We can use rhetoric to examine our language, truths, and identifications. It's true that we can find rhetoric everywhere, but it's more interesting to see how rhetoric shapes us, our language, our reality, our values, and what we produce as a result of that. With identification linked to rhetoric, we can then see how to drive language and classification works into our understanding of society, communities, and ourselves.
I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. It's a little...
For 40 years, everyone running for president has released their
Which found 1 in 4 Americans is skeptical of all the effects of climate
Before we hear about the remarkable underwater vehicles.